My parents kicked me out for refusing to raise my sister's baby, so I left quietly, became successful, and now they beg for a second chance. I'm a 25-year-old guy, and I've always been the responsible one in my family. Growing up, it felt like I was born with an invisible checklist of obligations: get good grades, help around the house, make sure everyone else's messes were cleaned up. My parents never said it outright, but their actions spoke louder than words. If I did something wrong, it was catastrophic. If my younger sister Lily made a mess, it was cute, quirky, or part of growing up. I learned early on to keep my opinions to myself and my mouth shut unless I wanted to be dismissed or scolded. Responsibility became my identity, not my choice, and over the years, I quietly built a sense of pride in being dependable, even when it went unnoticed. Lily, on the other hand, has always been the golden child. She's manipulative in ways that almost feel invisible, innocent smiles, paired with guilt-tripping words that can turn anyone against themselves. Parents shower her with praise for the smallest things: a clean room, a well-timed compliment, even just showing up on time. I, however, was expected to constantly give, sacrifice, and conform to their expectations without acknowledgement. Wasn't that I minded helping? Fairness and respect have always been my compass. But fairness, it seemed, was never in the cards for me. The first bombshell came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Lily, smirking like she'd just won a game, casually dropped the news. She was pregnant. Our parents' reaction was immediate, terrifyingly synchronized. "You're going to help raise this baby," Mom said, her voice firm but calm, like she was discussing dinner plans rather than an enormous life-altering request. Dad nodded, adding, "It's your responsibility. You know how to handle it." My chest tightened. My stomach churned. "Wait, I can't just raise someone else's child," I managed, my voice shaking. "I have my own plans, my own life." They didn't hear me. Instead, they framed my hesitation as selfishness, as if caring about my own future and ambitions was a crime. And in that instant, I realized this wasn't about family support, it was about control. They expected me to bend or be cast aside. I wanted to scream, to argue, but the weight of their disappointment pinned me to the kitchen floor. I had to make a choice, and whatever I did, nothing would ever feel the same again. I tried reasoning with them, though I knew deep down it might be pointless. "I can't drop everything and raise a baby, especially not hers," I said, my voice quieter this time, trying to stay calm. Mom's eyes narrowed, and Dad let out a sigh that made the room feel smaller, heavier. "You don't understand." "Responsibility," Mom said, tilting her head as if I were a stubborn child incapable of grasping basic life lessons. "This is family. You help family. You don't get to pick and choose when you're needed." Lily chimed in, her tone dripping with false innocence. "I mean, come on. You've always been the responsible one. Don't you think it's just natural that you'd help?" Her smile didn't reach her eyes. I felt my chest tighten, a mix of frustration, guilt, and anger, swirling into a tight knot. They were painting me as cold, uncaring, even cruel, just for refusing to sacrifice my life for her mistakes. I opened my mouth to explain again, but Dad cut me off. "We raised you to do the right thing. This is it. Don't make us regret it." The tension in the room was suffocating. Every word they spoke felt like a hammer striking my ribs, every glance like a silent accusation. I realized then that this wasn't about the baby. It was about power. My life, my choices, my autonomy, they wanted to strip it away and wrap me into their version of loyalty. My protests, my reasoning, my dreams of moving out, finishing school, building my own future, that didn't matter. I remember standing there, looking at the walls of my childhood home, walls that had once felt safe, filled with memories, now suddenly oppressive. The air smelled faintly of my mom's perfume and the remnants of dinner. But even familiar scents couldn't soften the sting of betrayal. I felt trapped in a cage I hadn't built, and then it hit me. No matter what I said, no matter how logical or emotional my argument, they weren't going to see my side. They were already framing me as the villain, the ungrateful son. I clenched my fists, my mind racing, and realized I had a choice fight. Argue, beg for understanding, or quietly decide my own path. But even considering walking away felt impossible. Would I stay and become the person they wanted, or finally choose myself, face the consequences that I could already feel creeping toward me? I spent that night lying awake on my childhood bed, staring at the ceiling like it might offer answers. The room smelled faintly of lavender from the sachets Mom had tucked into the drawers, and the hum of the street outside felt distant, almost mocking. I kept replaying the day over and over, every word, every look, every silent judgment. I felt my chest tighten with a mix of anger and helplessness. It wasn't just Lily's pregnancy anymore. It was everything I had endured growing up. All the times my parents expected me to sacrifice for her. All the invisible chains of responsibility they had wrapped around me. And now, they were dangling. This ultimatum like it was the natural order of things, as if my own dreams and autonomy didn't matter. I can't do this, I muttered to myself, the words tasting bitter and foreign. I could still hear Mom's voice, calm but firm, accusing me of selfishness. We're your family. You owe this to us, she'd said. It was relentless, suffocating, and for the first time, I realized just how much they had been gaslighting me all these years, making me feel guilty for wanting boundaries, for wanting a life outside their control. The next morning, the tension in the kitchen was palpable. Dad sipped his coffee like nothing had happened, and Lily smiled with that same calculating edge. "So, have you thought about it?" she asked, the words sweet but loaded. I felt my stomach twist. I just can't, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I have responsibilities, my own life to build. I can't drop everything for you. Mom's lips pressed into a thin line, and I could see the disappointment radiating from her, heavy enough to feel on my shoulders. "Disappointing," she said quietly, almost venomously. "We thought you'd understand what family means. Clearly we were wrong." It cut deeper than any argument ever could. It wasn't just words, it was the weight of being unconditionally rejected by the people who were supposed to protect me, support me, love me. I realized then that I was no longer negotiating a single decision about a baby. I was facing the culmination of years of manipulation, favoritism, and emotional abuse. I looked around the kitchen, at the home that had once felt safe, and I felt a cold clarity settle in. I couldn't stay here. Not if this was what my life with them would always be. But leaving meant stepping into the unknown. And as I glanced at Lily's smug face, I wondered if I had the strength to finally choose myself by the time dinner rolled around. That evening, I felt completely hollowed out, like I was observing my own life from a distance. The smell of roast chicken and garlic mashed potatoes, usually comforting, made my stomach twist into knots. Every bite Lily took, every laugh she forced, felt like salt in a wound I hadn't realized was still bleeding. I tried to focus on small things, the clink of cutlery, the hum of the fridge, but my mind kept circling back to the ultimatum. Help raise her baby or leave. My chest felt tight, my thoughts jumbled, and the room seemed smaller, suffocating under the weight of unspoken expectations and judgment. "Don't be like this," Dad said, finally breaking the silence. His voice carrying that tone of quiet disappointment that had always felt like a punch to the gut. "You're making it personal. It's about responsibility." I wanted to scream, to tell him it was personal, precisely because he'd spent my entire life manipulating me, controlling me, and pitting me against my own desires. But the words got caught in my throat. Mom leaned forward, her eyes sharp, her voice calm but terrifying in its certainty. "You're lucky Lily is still willing to let you be involved at all. Most people in your position would have walked away entirely." Lucky. I wasn't lucky. I was being coerced. I was being punished for wanting a life beyond servitude to their favoritism. Lily smirked across the table. "Come on, you're the responsible one. You've done this your whole life, haven't you? Just one more thing, one tiny sacrifice." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. That casual manipulation, the way she framed her demands as a favor, as something natural, made my stomach churn. I realized then that this wasn't about helping family. It was about control, about making me feel trapped and guilty until I surrendered. I wanted to break. I felt my chest tighten, my hands clench into fists under the table. The walls, once safe and familiar, now felt like a cage. For the first time, I considered something I'd never dared: leaving. Quietly, without confrontation. Without explanation, without the endless arguing that never changed a thing. My heart raced, panic and relief mingling in a way I couldn't untangle, as I excused myself from the table, uttering something about being tired. I knew one thing with absolute clarity: nothing here would ever be the same again. And stepping away, even for a moment, felt terrifyingly liberating. That night, I lay on my bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind buzzing with every word exchanged at dinner. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak from the floorboard. Sounds that once felt comforting now seemed ominous, almost mocking. I felt a strange mix of fear, guilt, and relief swirling inside me. For years, I had followed the unspoken rules of this family, bending to their will, sacrificing my happiness and suppressing my own needs. But tonight, the thought of staying and continuing that cycle made my chest ache in a way that nothing else ever had. I began quietly packing a small duffel bag, each fold of clothing feeling heavier than the last. It wasn't about running away. It was about reclaiming control over my life, over the choices I had been denied for so long. I took only the essentials: a few changes of clothes, my laptop, and a small notebook where I scribbled plans for the future. The act of packing, simple as it seemed, felt like the first real decision I had made for myself in years. I could almost taste freedom, but it was mingled with the bitter sting of leaving behind everything I had ever known. As I slipped out the back door, the cool night air hit me, sharp and invigorating. The streets smelled faintly of wet asphalt from an earlier rain. The distant hum of traffic felt like a new rhythm, one that belonged entirely to me. I paused at the corner, listening for any sound of pursuit, any last attempt at guilt or manipulation. But there was nothing, just the quiet of the world outside the walls that had confined me. I didn't have a plan, not really. I had a few savings tucked away from odd jobs, and a part-time position lined up at a small company, but the rest was unknown territory. And yet for the first time, that uncertainty felt exhilarating instead of terrifying. I realized that leaving wasn't the end, it was a beginning. Still, as I walked toward the streetlights, my heart pounding in rhythm with each step, I couldn't help but glance back at the house one last time. It was silent, dark, and oblivious to the choice I had made. I had stepped into freedom, but I knew deep down that the journey ahead would test me in ways I couldn't yet imagine. The first few weeks after leaving were harder than I ever imagined. The apartment I rented was tiny, with peeling paint and a faint smell of mildew that no amount of cleaning could completely erase. I had never lived completely on my own, and suddenly, every decision from grocery shopping to paying bills to making dinner rested solely on me. Some nights I would collapse on the thin mattress, exhausted, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had made a huge mistake. The fear of failing, of not being able to support myself, gnawed at the edges of my resolve. But beneath that fear, there was something new, a flicker of pride. A small thrill in knowing that every choice I made now was truly mine. Work became my anchor. My first week at the office was a whirlwind of learning, mistakes, and late nights. I had underestimated how much effort it would take to juggle everything. But I also underestimated how good it felt to prove to myself that I could. The quiet satisfaction of completing tasks on my own, of seeing my own name on successful projects, was intoxicating. Even the mundane tasks, filing reports, organizing spreadsheets, answering emails, felt like victories. For the first time, I was building a life that didn't revolve around someone else's whims. But freedom came with its own challenges. Occasionally, my phone would buzz with messages from Mom or Lily, subtle reminders that they still expected me to bend, to help, to sacrifice. "We just want what's best for the family," Mom would text. Her words carefully measured to guilt me without overt confrontation. I deleted most of them without reading, but a few slipped through, lingering in my chest and forcing me to relive the suffocating arguments. I hated how easily they could still stir up doubt and guilt. Then came the unexpected opportunity that changed everything. A meeting with a mentor I had met during a workshop months earlier. He offered guidance, connections, and advice that suddenly made my career trajectory feel achievable, almost within reach. I remember walking home that night, the cool air on my face, a sense of possibility buzzing inside me. The life I had been denied for so long suddenly seemed attainable, but it also meant that returning to my old family, their expectations and manipulations, was no longer an option. I smiled to myself for the first time in months, but the thought of what I had left behind still lingered. They were waiting, unaware that I was already planning my own path, one that didn't include them. And I knew, deep down, they wouldn't take that lightly. Months passed, and I started to see the fruits of my independence. The small victories at work, finishing projects ahead of schedule, receiving praise from supervisors, even a modest raise began to build a sense of confidence I hadn't felt in years. The apartment, once oppressive and unfamiliar, slowly became home. One added a few personal touches, a plant by the window, small bookshelf, and a framed photo of a place I wanted to visit someday. Each detail reminded me that this life was mine to shape, free from manipulation or favoritism. But even as my world expanded, the shadow of my family lingered. Occasionally, I'd receive messages from Mom, disguised as casual check-ins, but loaded with subtext. "We hope you're making good choices," she'd write, implying disappointment without saying it outright. Lily sent photos of herself, the baby, and her life, always with a faint hint of expectation. A reminder that she had once relied on me and still expected me to. Each message stirred a familiar twinge of guilt. It's the kind I had fought so hard to suppress. Work continued to demand more of me, but in a way that felt rewarding. My mentor pushed me to take risks, to stretch beyond the boundaries I had unconsciously accepted for so long. I started networking, taking on bigger responsibilities, and slowly, my ambitions began to align with reality. The more I achieved, the more I realized how much I had been underestimated, not just by my family, but by myself. And then, the first subtle sign of envy appeared. My parents, who had once dismissed my aspirations as trivial, began inquiring indirectly about my life. "Are you keeping busy?" Mom asked one afternoon in a message that felt more like surveillance than concern. "We heard you're doing well. We hope it's all true." It was almost laughable, the way they tiptoed around their curiosity. Trying to disguise their interest, I felt a surge of satisfaction, tinged with caution. They had underestimated me, tried to control me, and now they were watching from afar. I smiled quietly to myself, savoring the irony, but I also knew that this was just the beginning. The more they realized I was thriving without them, the more desperate their attempts would become. And somewhere deep down, I understood they weren't going to give up easily. By the time I hit my 1-year mark of living independently, my life had transformed in ways I hadn't dared to imagine when I first left. My career was taking off faster than I expected: promotions, recognition, and a growing network of people who valued me for my skills and dedication. The apartment felt less like a temporary refuge and more like a sanctuary, a place I had carved out entirely for myself. I could walk into a room and decide exactly how I wanted to spend my time, what I wanted to eat, and when I wanted to sleep. Small freedoms that had once felt impossible now made my chest swell with quiet pride. And then, out of nowhere, the first contact from my parents that wasn't laced with guilt arrived. A text from Mom. "We're proud of you, even if we didn't show it before. Maybe we could meet soon?" At first, I was stunned. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure if I wanted to respond. Part of me wanted to laugh, part wanted to ignore it, and part wanted to feel the warmth of familial approval I'd long been denied. But deep down, I knew better than to trust their sudden pride. Not long after, I received a call from Dad, and his voice was unusually soft, almost hesitant. "We'd like to talk. About everything. Can we come by?" I could hear the subtle edge of pleading beneath the surface, stark contrast to the firm ultimatums and disappointment I'd endured for years. For a moment, I felt a flicker of old familiarity, the pull of family, but I immediately remembered the nights of guilt, of arguments that never ended, of being blamed for someone else's mistakes. Lily, too, made an appearance in my life through indirect channels, photos of the baby, updates on her life, always with that subtle reminder that I had once been expected to step in. Seeing her happiness without me stirred a mix of frustration and vindication. I had chosen myself, built my life from scratch, and yet I could see them trying to weave me back into the drama I had escaped. I walked through the city that evening, the cool wind on my face carrying the distant sounds of traffic and chatter, and felt a strange mix of triumph and wariness. They were watching, curious, envious, maybe even a little scared of the life I had built without them. And I realized something chilling. If they thought a simple apology or plea could pull me back, they were sorely mistaken. But how far would they go to try? And what lengths would I need to protect what I had built? The tension hummed under my skin like electricity, and I knew the real test had only just begun. The day finally came when I agreed reluctantly to meet my parents face to face. I told myself it wasn't for them. It was for closure, to see exactly what kind of people had tried to control my life. I chose a quiet cafe, neutral ground. It's a kind of place that smelled faintly of coffee and pastries, with soft chatter in the background. I arrived early, my stomach twisting with a mix of anger, anticipation, and the tiniest spark of nervousness. My hands were clammy, my chest tight, but I reminded myself I was no longer the scared, compliant kid they had once dictated to when they walked in. Mom's eyes immediately searched mine, a flicker of calculation beneath the surface. Dad's posture was stiff, but his gaze betrayed a vulnerability that I hadn't seen before. Lily wasn't with them, thankfully, but I could feel her presence in the echo of their words. The way they phrased sentences, the subtle comparisons lurking beneath the surface. Mom started softly. We wanted to apologize for how things went, and maybe ask if we could be part of your life again. Her voice trembled slightly, as if she expected me to melt under the weight of her regret. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Apologize? I asked, my voice calm but edged with steel. After years of guilt, manipulation, and ultimatums, you didn't see my boundaries? You didn't respect my choices. And now, after all this time, you want a second chance? My words landed like stones on the table. Dad interjected, trying to soften the blow. We've realized we made mistakes. We were wrong. We just want to reconnect. But I saw through it the subtle pleas, the desperation to regain control, to test if I could be manipulated again. I realized in that moment that this wasn't about reconciliation. It was about them trying to restore the hierarchy they had built for years. I leaned back, letting the silence stretch, tasting the bitter satisfaction of power shifting back into my hands. I had the choice now, and I was no longer trapped. But the question lingered, heavy and electrifying. Would I allow them back into my life on my terms, or would I finally shut the door completely, leaving them to confront the consequences of their own manipulation? The tension in the air was almost unbearable. I could feel the climax of this long, twisted story hovering just within reach. Sitting across from them, I felt a strange mix of anger, amusement, and power. The roles had reversed. I was no longer the obedient, compliant child. I was the one in control, deciding if and how they would be part of my life. I watched Mom's hand tremble slightly as she reached for her coffee, and Dad's eyes darted nervously around the cafe, clearly uncomfortable in this new dynamic. Their attempts at charm, at guilt, at subtle pleading were all laid bare. I realized how predictable their patterns were, how transparent the manipulation had always been. I've spent years building a life outside of your control, I said, my voice calm but firm. I chose independence, and I worked every day to create a life where I don't have to justify myself to anyone. That includes you. I saw their faces tighten. They weren't used to being confronted like this. They had always expected compliance. I continued, carefully but deliberately. If you want to be part of my life, it will be on my terms. I won't be dragged back into the old cycle of guilt and control. Mom's voice quivered. We want to make amends. Can't we try to be a family again? I shook my head slightly, savoring the clarity I felt. A family isn't just about blood or appearances. It's about respect, trust, and honesty. And for years, you violated every one of those principles. You can't just apologize and expect everything to go back to the way it was. Dad leaned back, exhaling slowly, clearly realizing that their usual tactics wouldn't work. For a moment there was silence, broken only by the hum of the cafe and the faint clatter of cups from a nearby table. I felt the weight of all those years, every guilt trip, every manipulation, every expectation to sacrifice myself finally shift off my shoulders. "I'm willing to forgive," I added. "But forgiveness doesn't mean business as usual. If you want a place in my life, it will be earned, and it will be on my terms, not yours." I watched their expressions flicker between disbelief and reluctant understanding. For the first time, I felt the full power of my own boundaries. And as I stood to leave the cafe, the air outside cool and crisp, I realized that the hardest part was over, but the satisfaction of finally reclaiming my life was only beginning. Weeks passed after that meeting, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't known existed. Work was thriving, my apartment felt like home. The little routines I had built, morning coffee, evening walks, weekend projects, were entirely my own. I no longer had to worry about unsolicited advice, manipulation, or guilt trips from my family. For the first time, I was living a life that reflected my choices, my effort, my ambitions. And with each passing day, the weight of their expectations faded, replaced by pride in my independence. But the subtle attempts from my parents didn't stop entirely. They sent occasional messages, always polite, always careful, testing the boundaries I had set. "We'd love to hear from you," one would read, or "just checking in, hope everything's okay." I deleted most of them without reading, a quiet power play of my own. It was satisfying to realize that they could no longer control me through guilt or obligation. I had built a life too solid, too independent, for them to manipulate. Then came a moment that felt almost ironic. Lily, who had once relied on me for everything, reached out, her tone hesitant, asking for advice about the baby. I could feel the old patterns surfacing, but this time, I didn't panic or feel pressured. I listened, offered measured guidance, and reminded myself that helping did not mean surrendering. It was on my terms, and I realized just how much power I had gained by leaving, by choosing myself. I had become the one who set the rules. I also began to notice the subtle envy in my parents' words whenever I shared achievements with mutual acquaintances or friends. They had spent so long trying to control my path that they couldn't fathom I could succeed without them. And it was intoxicating in a quiet, almost meditative way to watch them realize that the person they had underestimated, the scapegoat, the selfish one, was thriving. As I sat by the window one evening, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, I felt a deep, satisfying sense of closure. The betrayal, the manipulation, the expectations, they no longer held power over me. I had endured, grown, and emerged stronger. And somewhere in that quiet triumph, I knew I had finally won, not through revenge, but through reclaiming my life entirely on my terms. Sitting in my apartment, I finally allowed myself to reflect on the journey that had brought me here. The years of manipulation, favoritism, and emotional abuse had left scars, but they had also forged a resilience I hadn't known I possessed. I thought back to that rainy Thursday when Lily had announced her pregnancy and my parents had demanded I take responsibility. That moment had seemed like the end of the world. Now, I could see it clearly. It had been the beginning of my liberation. I had chosen myself when no one else would, and every step since had been a testament to my strength. Mom and Dad had reached out again, cautiously this time with more humility, but I noticed the hesitation in their words. They no longer demanded compliance or attempted manipulation. Instead, there was recognition, perhaps even respect, for the life I had built independently. I read their messages with a calm mind, understanding that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It meant accepting my own boundaries and making peace with the past. And for the first time, I felt free to decide whether they deserved a place in my life at all. Lily, too, had come to rely on my guidance, but on terms I controlled. I could be there for her without sacrificing myself, without stepping back into old patterns of guilt and coercion. Helping had become a choice, not a mandate, and that difference made all the difference. I realized I had reclaimed my autonomy in a way my family could never take away. I thought of the small victories, the promotions at work, the friends who respected me, the apartment that was truly mine, and the pride in knowing I had built a life from nothing but determination. I had faced manipulation, betrayal, and pressure to conform, and I had emerged not just intact, but empowered. As I looked out the window at the city lights flickering in the night, a calm satisfaction settled over me. I had closed the chapter on their control, on their guilt trips, and on being the responsible one for everyone else's mistakes. I was finally living on my own terms, with my dignity intact and my future entirely my own. And in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty I had won. Not through confrontation or revenge, but through courage, persistence, and the unwavering choice to put myself first. The past no longer had a hold on me, and the future bright, unburdened, and mind stretched endlessly ahead.